He said it like he was embarrassed to hear his own words, barely moving his lips, as if someone in the cafe might overhear him say something indecent. "Mom, maybe it's better if you don't come visit right now. The kids are used to a certain lifestyle." That was the sentence that cracked something quiet inside me. Not a scream, not a heartbreak, just the dull snap of something that had been bending too long. I didn't argue. I nodded, smiled politely, and told him I understood. Because that's what mothers do when their sons look at them like an inconvenience wrapped in love. I went back to my apartment, the one-bedroom walk-up with the slow elevator and the view of the laundromat, and I sat at the kitchen table until the light shifted across the wall and the tea in my cup turned cold. I stared at the pale ring it left on the table and thought how easy it is to become invisible when people decide you no longer fit the picture they've built around themselves. I am 78 years old, retired from the same hospital where I worked for 41 years. I was the nurse who stayed when others fainted, the one who held the hand of a man dying of pneumonia and whispered a prayer for his frightened wife. I raised Peter alone after his father died. I paid for his braces, his field trips, his first car. I sold the small house his father and I built with our hands so that he could go to college on the East Coast because he wanted to study finance and said Oregon felt too small for his ambition. I was proud then, proud and naive, believing that love was a kind of currency that never devalued. But life teaches you that even the purest investments can go bankrupt if you trust the wrong market. Peter became successful, or so people said. He married Caroline, a woman with perfect posture and a voice that always sounded like she was about to give instructions to a waiter. Together, they built a life of polished surfaces, glass, steel, curated smiles. I used to think success meant comfort. But with them, it looked more like containment, as if every joy had to be measured and approved before being shown. When their first child was born, I crocheted a blanket, pale yellow, soft as breath. Caroline thanked me with an email saying it didn't quite match the nursery's color palette. I remember reading that line 3 times, wondering when affection started requiring coordination. Over the years, visits became shorter, calls more infrequent, and conversations clipped. Peter always sounded like someone hurrying to end a meeting, and yet every time he called me Mom, a small part of me still rose in hope, the way a plant bends toward the memory of light. That day, when he told me I was too poor to visit, he wrapped it in the soft packaging of practicality. He said their new neighborhood was a little high-end, that the kids were still adjusting, that maybe later would be better. Later, the word that has broken more hearts than goodbye. I hung up and sat staring at the wall clock that had stopped years ago at 2:47. It didn't bother me before. I liked its silence. But that evening I heard it tick, faintly, even though it wasn't working. It was just my heart trying to fill the emptiness with sound. I thought of all the times I'd helped Peter climb, paid his rent when he was between jobs, covered his health insurance 1 year, wired him money when he said his bonus was delayed. I didn't keep receipts. Mothers don't. But the mind keeps ledgers even when the heart pretends not to. My neighbor, Mrs. Feldman, knocked that night to bring me soup. She asked if Peter was coming for the holidays. I said no, not this year. She sighed in that way older women do, the sigh that says, "I know, dear, I know," and left me with her Tupperware and a pity I didn't want but couldn't reject. Later, I sat by the window and watched the lights of other families in the building. I could hear laughter through the thin walls, the sound of someone frying onions, a child practicing piano off-key. all the small noises of belonging. My own apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant siren of an ambulance, my old world calling to me like a ghost. I went to my closet and pulled down the tin box where I keep old papers. Inside were letters from Peter when he was in college, messy handwriting, full of gratitude and jokes. Beneath them, the folder I hadn't opened in years, the mortgage agreement for his first house, my name, printed neatly next to his. I had helped him buy it, loaned him half the down payment, though he'd insisted he'd pay me back. He never did, and I never asked. But seeing that folder again made something shift. It reminded me that love isn't the same as ownership, but sometimes ownership is the only protection left when love turns selective. I stayed up that night rereading his letters, tracing the signatures like relics. One line caught me. "Don't ever think I'll forget what you've done for me, Mom." The ink had faded, but the irony was still fresh. Around midnight, I went into the kitchen and washed the same cup I'd used all day. It felt heavier, though nothing had changed but my perception. Outside, the streetlight flickered, illuminating the frost on the window. I pressed my palm to the glass and whispered to no one, "Too poor to visit." The words sounded absurd in the quiet, like a bad joke told in a cathedral. Poor in what, exactly? In taste? In style? In the ability to pretend I'd forgotten who I was? I thought of the hospital corridors, of blood under my nails, of double shifts that left my legs trembling, but my pride intact. If poverty meant living without pretense, then I had been rich all along, and he was the one starving for something real. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I put on my coat and walked to the corner cafe, the same one where Peter used to do his homework when he was 12. The chairs were new, but the smell of coffee was the same. I ordered a cup and sat by the window. The city was waking up, indifferent and merciful. That's when I made the quiet promise that would later change everything. I would stop asking to be included. I would stop waiting for permission to exist in his world. If my son thought I was too poor to visit, he would soon learn how wealth is measured by endurance, by the ability to rebuild after every dismissal. He would learn it not through lectures or guilt, but through the simple fact of my presence in a place he thought was beyond my reach. At that moment, I didn't know how or when, only that I would no longer be a guest in a life I helped build. Sometimes the richest revenge is simply to stand where you were, once told you didn't belong, and let them see that the ground recognizes you. 2 days later, I received an invitation that was not really an invitation at all. It came as a polite message from Caroline, my daughter-in-law, written in that clipped, sugary tone she used when she wanted to sound kind but keep control. "Peter and I are hosting a small gathering for colleagues next week," she wrote. "It's just a professional thing. But if you happen to be in town, maybe we could see you for a quick coffee beforehand." The maybe said everything. It was not an opening. It was a precaution. Still, I replied yes, because mothers say yes even when the yes is heavy. I took the early train, dressed carefully, ironed my best blouse, the one Peter once said made me look distinguished. When I reached the cafe near their office, he was already there, phone in hand, scrolling through something as if he were afraid to meet my eyes. I waved, and he smiled. That tight, managerial smile that belongs to men who've learned to disguise shame as composure. He stood to kiss my cheek, but barely touched me. Caroline arrived minutes later, crisp as paper, holding a drink that wasn't coffee, but something green and expensive. She greeted me like a client. So good you could make it, she said, as if I were the one who'd requested this meeting. We sat by the window, and I told them about the rain back home, the community garden, the new neighbors with their barking dog. They nodded at intervals, polite but distant, their eyes drifting to their phones. After a few minutes, Peter leaned forward, elbows on the table, and said, "Mom, I want to ask something a little sensitive." My stomach tightened the way it does before bad news, the way it used to when doctors whispered outside a patient's room. He cleared his throat. "We've been thinking about the kids and their environment. You know, they're at that age where impressions matter. Caroline's parents are helping with tuition at the academy, and there's a certain presentation we have to maintain. You understand, right?" I stared at him, trying to decode the business jargon for what it was. A family eviction notice disguised as etiquette. "I think so," I said slowly. He nodded, relieved by my calmness, and continued. "It's not that we don't want you around, of course not. It's just that your situation, your apartment, it's humble, and Caroline worries the contrast might confuse the kids." He smiled like a doctor delivering a diagnosis he didn't believe in, but had to repeat. I looked at Caroline. She was stirring her drink, though there was nothing left to dissolve. She didn't meet my eyes. "They're children," I said finally, "not investors." Peter exhaled, as if I had confirmed his fear that I would embarrass him. "Please, Mom, don't make this harder. We're trying to manage things gracefully. Maybe when we move into the new house, we can have you over. It'll just be easier when the space feels right." Space. That word again. Space between classes, between appearances, between mother and son. I wanted to ask if grace meant deleting the person who made his existence possible, but I didn't. I sat quietly, letting their discomfort fill the air. Then I said, "You do what you think is best for your family." He relaxed, mistaking surrender for agreement. They paid the bill, Caroline insisted, of course, and left with practiced efficiency. I stayed behind for a long time, watching the rain blur the reflections in the window until the glass looked like a watercolor of my life, shapes dissolving into each other until none of them made sense. That night, I opened the old folder again, the one with the mortgage papers from the house Peter used to own before this new life of curated perfection. My name was still printed next to his. I traced the ink slowly, the way one might touch the outline of a scar. I remembered the night he called me years ago, voice cracking, saying the bank was about to foreclose. I had emptied the last of my savings, sold the gold watch his father gave me, and wired him the money. He promised to pay me back as soon as the bonus hits. It never did, but he bought Caroline a diamond ring that spring. I remember congratulating them, telling myself generosity was its own reward. Now, staring at those documents, I felt the first flicker of something dangerous. Clarity. I realized he had learned to treat kindness as a renewable resource, and I had taught him that lesson by never letting him face scarcity. Mothers call it love. The world calls it enabling. I thought about throwing the papers away, burning them like old shame, but something stopped me. A small, sharp instinct whispered that one day I might need proof, not of what I'd given, but of who I still was. The next morning, the phone rang. Peter again. His voice was light, almost cheerful. "Hey, Mom, just checking in. Did you get home safe?" I said yes. He hesitated. "Listen, about yesterday. I hope you didn't take it the wrong way. Caroline just gets anxious about social stuff. You know how she is." I said I understood. He sighed in relief. Then, as if he couldn't help himself, he added, "You've always been practical. I knew you'd see reason." I hung up and sat still for a long time. The word reason echoed in my head like a bell tolling in an empty church. Reason had always been his way of naming my silence. Later that week, a letter arrived from a law office in Seattle. I assumed it was some routine error until I opened it and read the first line. "We regret to inform you of the passing of your sister, Eleanor." My breath caught. We hadn't spoken in years, not from anger, but from life's slow erosion. The letter went on to explain that she had left a property in my name, a small apartment building downtown, fully paid off but in disrepair. I read the words twice before they made sense. I had no idea she owned anything, let alone something so large. The letter included a single sentence that broke me more than Peter's rejection ever could. She said you were the only one who never asked her for anything. I folded the paper and placed it on the table beside my cold coffee. For the first time in years, I laughed, a low, startled laugh that felt like a door opening in my chest. The next day, I took a bus to see the building. It stood on a quiet street, lined with old trees, their roots pushing against the cracked pavement like stubborn memories refusing to stay buried. The facade was faded, paint peeling, windows clouded with dust, but the bones were strong. I walked through the courtyard, overgrown with weeds and wildflowers that had grown without permission. I touched the iron railing, cold and steady, and felt something inside me align. It wasn't beauty, not yet, but potential. A man passing by slowed his step and said, "You looking to rent?" I smiled. "Maybe I'm looking to own." He laughed, not unkindly, and moved on. I stayed a while, listening to the sound of pigeons cooing from the roof and the distant hum of traffic. For the first time since that cafe, my breath felt full. I didn't know what I would do with this inheritance, but I knew it was mine. Not borrowed, not conditional, not politely tolerated. Mine. That night, I dreamt of Peter as a boy again, sitting at the kitchen table, counting the change from his paper route, proud of every coin. He used to say, "Someday I'll buy you a big house, Mom, with a porch and a garden." I woke up before I could answer him. The room was dark, except for the moonlight tracing the edge of the papers on my desk. I reached out and touched them. The mortgage deed with our names and the new one from Eleanor's lawyer, side by side. Two versions of love, one that demanded repayment and one that simply gave. I thought of calling Peter, telling him about the building, but then I remembered his voice saying, "A certain lifestyle," and I knew this wasn't news I would share. This wasn't his story. It was mine. By dawn, I had made my decision. I would take care of the property myself, restore it, make it live again. I didn't need permission, advice, or validation. I didn't even need thanks. What I needed was a place that didn't shrink to fit someone else's comfort. When the sun rose, I made a list on the back of an old grocery receipt. Call the lawyer, hire an inspector, change the locks, breathe. It was the first to-do list I'd written in years that didn't include anyone else's name. I poured myself another cup of coffee, stronger this time, and smiled. The catalyst wasn't the insult itself. It was the silence that followed. The space where self-respect finally found a voice. Sometimes it takes being told you don't belong to remember you own the ground you're standing on. The first months after I inherited the building felt like stepping into a forgotten version of myself, a woman who still believed she could fix what was broken if she worked hard enough. Every morning I took the early bus downtown, carrying a thermos of coffee and a notebook full of sketches. Meeting with inspectors who spoke in acronyms and sighed at the old pipes, as if they were judging my age through the plumbing. The place smelled of damp plaster and stubbornness, but I loved it instantly. The tenants were few, an elderly couple who kept to themselves, a single mother with 2 children who played ball in the courtyard, and a young man who never looked up from his laptop. They all seemed wary of me at first. This gray-haired woman in worn shoes who asked too many questions and took pictures of cracks in the walls. But soon, they started leaving notes on my door about leaks or noises, written politely, as if they sensed I would care, and I did. I learned the rhythm of the building, the creak of the stairs, the whistle of the radiator in winter, the smell of onions that drifted up every evening from apartment 2. I stopped feeling like a visitor in my own life. Money was tight, but not impossible. I sold my car, canceled the cable, and used every dollar wisely. The contractor I hired was an old friend of my late husband's, a patient man who called me boss lady, and meant it kindly. Together, we patched walls, replaced light fixtures, planted geraniums in cracked pots by the entrance. I started keeping the front door open during the day so sunlight could spill into the hallway, and the tenants began stopping to chat. The young mother, Lila, sometimes brought me muffins from her night shift at the bakery. We would sit on the steps, eating in silence. 2 women at different ends of exhaustion, but somehow equal. It felt good to be needed again, to belong to something physical and immediate, not just memories. Peter called twice that season, always rushed, always distracted. He never asked where I spent my time. I didn't offer. He spoke of market trends, of Caroline's charity gala, of the children's new tutors. I listened, made the right noises, and hung up feeling the same dull ache, but smaller now, more distant, like an echo fading down a hallway. I began to realize that distance can be mercy when closeness only bruises. The building gave me purpose, and purpose has its own warmth. By spring, the place started to change. The peeling paint was gone, the windows shone, and a small patch of green appeared where weeds used to be. People began to smile when they walked in. One afternoon, while checking mail in the lobby, I overheard Lila telling another tenant, "The owner's turning this place around." The owner. The word startled me. I hadn't thought of myself that way before. Ownership had always sounded greedy, masculine, a word for people like Peter who measured worth in square footage. But as I stood there holding a bundle of envelopes, I felt something shift. Ownership, I realized, wasn't about possession. It was about care, responsibility, roots. It was the opposite of what Peter believed. He thought owning meant controlling. I was learning that it meant tending. In May, I decided to move into one of the smaller vacant units on the top floor. The others thought I was crazy, but I wanted to live where my work was, to feel the pulse of the place under my feet. The room was simple. 1 window, a squeaky radiator, and a view of the courtyard. I furnished it with things from thrift shops, a sturdy table, a faded armchair, a lamp shaped like a tulip. When I moved my boxes in, the walls felt like they were exhaling, as if they'd been waiting for someone to come home. At night, I could hear the sounds of life below me, the laughter, the footsteps, the occasional argument, all of it blending into a kind of heartbeat. For the first time in years, I slept deeply. Peter didn't know about the inheritance. I had told him I was doing some volunteer work downtown, and he never asked for details. He liked me best as a background figure, stable, but unseen. I decided not to disturb his illusion. Let him think of me as quiet and small. It gave me freedom to grow. But sometimes, when I was sanding a doorframe or painting a wall, I would think of his words, too poor to visit, and a flicker of anger would rise. Not sharp, just steady. The kind that fuels rather than burns. That anger built the new stair rail, polished the tiles, paid the bills on time. It was a good, useful anger. By late summer, the building was nearly full again. Word had spread that it was a safe, fair place to live. The rent I charged was modest, but enough to keep everything running. I hired a local boy to mow the small patch of grass and trim the vines. He called me Ms. M, and I found myself smiling when he did. Every time I wrote a receipt or fixed a window latch, I thought of how Peter would have dismissed this kind of work as menial. To me, it was sacred. Every nail, every brushstroke was proof that I hadn't been erased. One evening, as I sat by the window counting receipts, I saw a familiar car pull up to the curb. A sleek black sedan, the kind that announces its owner before the door even opens. My heart gave a small, traitorous flutter. Peter stepped out, phone pressed to his ear, frowning. He didn't see me. He walked toward the neighboring cafe, talking fast, the rhythm of someone sealing deals that never fill the hollow. I watched him disappear around the corner, tall, confident, and utterly separate. I wanted to call out, but something in me stayed still. That stillness felt like strength. After he left, I went downstairs and stood in the courtyard, breathing the evening air. The lights from the windows glowed soft and warm. Children were drawing with chalk on the steps. Somewhere, a radio played an old song from my youth. I thought of how easily a life can change direction, not with explosions, but with quiet choices. Mine had turned in silence, like a river finding a new path. I wasn't rich, not in the way Peter measured it, but I was building something far sturdier than wealth. I was building presence. Weeks passed. The rhythm of the building became my rhythm. Repairs slowed. Peace settled. Then one morning, the property manager handed me a list of new rental inquiries. I scanned the names absently until one made me stop. Peter Harland. My heart thudded once, hard. The note said, requesting 2-bedroom near good schools. I stared at it for a long time, then folded the paper neatly and slipped it into my pocket. I didn't call him. Not yet. I wanted to see if fate had a sense of humor. That afternoon, I walked through every apartment, checking locks, windows, fixtures, pretending I was just doing routine maintenance, but really memorizing the feel of the place, the smell of fresh paint, the echoes of voices that no longer sounded lonely. When I reached the top of the stairs, I paused. Below me, sunlight streamed through the open door, turning the dust into gold. I thought of Peter's polished world, his careful distances, his curated perfection. And then I thought of this building, imperfect, alive, full of noise and human smell. And I knew where I belonged. That night, I sat at my desk and opened my ledger. Under pending applications, I wrote his name again, in my own handwriting, slow and deliberate. I didn't know then what I would do, whether I'd approve it or let the universe decide. But for the first time since he'd said those words, I wasn't the one waiting for permission. I closed the book and smiled. Sometimes revenge doesn't arrive with trumpets. It arrives quietly, through paperwork and patience. I turned off the lamp. The room went dark, and I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that comes when the story you thought was ending is just beginning its next chapter. When Peter's application finally came through the management office, I read it twice, not because I didn't believe it, but because disbelief had long ago become my shield against disappointment. His handwriting had changed, more angular now, impatient, like a man who signs his name only to make something official, never to make it personal. The cover letter, brief and polite, said they were seeking a stable, well-maintained residence close to the children's school. It was almost funny. Stability was what I had always offered him, and what he had spent his adulthood pretending he didn't need. The property manager, unaware of our connection, spoke of him with professional respect. Seems like a responsible tenant. Good credit, solid employment, family of 4. I nodded, pretending to deliberate, though in truth I'd already decided. I wanted them there. Not for revenge, at least not the kind he would recognize, but because something in me needed to see how the illusion of hierarchy collapses when the ground shifts beneath it. I approved the lease, added a modest discount for good faith, and signed the document with a steady hand. When the manager left, I sat for a while in the empty office, listening to the hum of the old refrigerator and thinking about cycles. How the same people who once diminished you can end up standing under your roof, unknowing, unguarded, ordinary. They moved in 2 weeks later, a Friday afternoon. I watched from my window as the moving truck pulled up, blocking half the street. Peter directed the workers with the same brisk efficiency he had used on me years ago. That blend of charm and condescension that once made me shrink and now only made me tired. Caroline appeared next, wearing a pale linen dress, holding her phone like a compass. The children tumbled out of the car, loud and bright, running circles on the pavement. I stayed hidden behind the curtain, not out of fear, but to savor the surreal peace of anonymity. They didn't know. They couldn't know. I was just another tenant, a quiet old woman upstairs, invisible until I chose otherwise. When the movers carried the last box inside, I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath for hours. The first weeks passed without incident. I saw them sometimes in the courtyard, Caroline with her coffee, Peter talking into his phone, the children chasing each other around the tree I'd planted in the spring. They looked comfortable, almost happy. I wondered if they ever thought of me, if Peter felt a flicker of guilt when he saw a woman my age struggling with groceries or waiting for a bus. Probably not. Guilt was a language he'd never learned to speak. I didn't resent it. I just observed. Observation is its own kind of power, the quiet power of knowing more than the people who believe you are irrelevant. The building began to hum differently with them inside it. Their presence changed the air, sharpened it. Other tenants spoke of them in half-curious tones, noting their expensive stroller, the perfume that lingered in the hallway, the way Caroline avoided eye contact. I said nothing, only listened, half amused that my tenants were now gossiping about my son without realizing it. The irony was so clean it almost sparkled. Then one evening, a thunderstorm rolled through the city. Heavy rain, sudden wind, the kind that makes windows rattle and old memories stir. I went downstairs to check the basement pumps and found a small leak near the electrical panel. I was kneeling with a flashlight when I heard footsteps. Peter's voice called out, "Is someone down here?" I froze, then answered calmly, "Maintenance." The light from his phone caught my face for a split second, but the beam moved on before recognition could settle. He muttered a quick thanks and left. I stood there in the half-dark, smiling to myself. I had existed 2 feet from him, unseen, unacknowledged, and perfectly fine. For once, invisibility was my choice, not his. Days later, Carolyn slipped a note into the building's mailbox, addressed to management. It was written in her elegant cursive, the kind that used to decorate their wedding invitations. "Thank you for maintaining such a lovely property," she wrote. "It's a relief to find a landlord who truly cares about the details." I read it 3 times, half laughing, half sad. She had spent years treating me like an embarrassment, and now praised my dedication without realizing whose hands were behind the work. I tucked the note into my journal, not as proof, but as poetry. But the truth is, peace never lasts long when it's built over silence. About a month into their stay, I noticed small things. The way Peter's shoulders tensed in the hallway when he saw another tenant who didn't fit his picture of respectability. How Caroline began to complain about smells from the downstairs apartment, the noise of children playing that wasn't their own. They were polite complaints at first, filtered through the manager, worded like suggestions, but the tone was unmistakable. They were beginning to mark territory, to assert the same quiet superiority that had once exiled me. I wanted to step in, to tell them that this building wasn't a showroom, that the people living here were not accessories to their performance. But I stayed silent, waiting, letting them reveal themselves. Patience is the sharpest blade. One Saturday morning, I went to the courtyard to water the plants. The youngest child, a little girl with Peter's eyes, was sitting on the steps, drawing with chalk. She looked up and smiled shyly. "Are you the flower lady?" she asked. I nodded. She showed me her drawing, a crooked sun, 2 stick figures, one taller than the other. "This is me," she said, pointing to the smaller one. "And that's Grandma. She's far away." I felt a pulse of something deep and aching. "She misses you very much," I said. The girl nodded thoughtfully and went back to coloring. I stood there, watering the geraniums, blinking against the sudden blur in my eyes. Children know truth instinctively. They see it even when adults bury it under manners. That afternoon, Peter crossed paths with me in the hallway for the first time since moving in. He held the elevator door open out of habit. I thanked him, stepping inside. He smiled politely, the way one smiles at strangers. I looked at his reflection in the metal wall and said, almost to myself, "You look just like your father when you frown." For a moment, he froze, eyes narrowing, the faintest flicker of recognition passing through them. Then the doors closed, and I was gone. I don't know if he ever placed me after that, but something in his expression lingered when we passed again days later. A puzzled courtesy, maybe even unease. It didn't matter. The power had shifted, quietly, irreversibly. As summer deepened, the building bloomed. Tenants hung plants from their balconies. Children played until dusk. Laughter echoed off the walls. Life had texture again, ordinary and miraculous. I often sat by my window at night, watching the lights turn off one by one, each a small prayer for peace. Downstairs, behind the drawn curtains, my son and his family lived their perfect little life under my roof, unaware that every inch of it, every wall and pipe and light bulb, was held together by the hands of the woman they'd once called too poor to visit. I didn't need to tell them. The knowledge itself was enough, a slow warmth spreading through me like sunrise after a long winter. Late autumn arrived with the kind of cold that crept through every seam, and the building seemed to contract with it. The old pipes sighing at night, the windows humming softly against the wind. I had finished most of the renovations by then, but something in me stayed restless, as if the silence itself was waiting for the next crack to appear. Peter and Caroline's family had settled into their apartment, turning it into an advertisement for domestic success. From the outside, everything looked perfect. The new curtains, the wreath on the door, the scent of cinnamon that leaked into the hallway on Sundays. But perfection always strains at the seams, and I began to feel the tension even from upstairs, a kind of invisible static that made the air heavier whenever they were home. Caroline started leaving messages for the manager, notes folded neatly and slipped under his door, about the heating, about parking, about the inconsistency of the cleaning service, even though the cleaning service was me on my knees in the hallway, with a bucket and rag. She never suspected, never looked closely enough to see that the woman she was complaining to was the same woman polishing her doorknob. It didn't offend me anymore. It amused me, a quiet theater of blindness. One afternoon, the manager called to say that the tenants in Unit 4 were moving out and that a new family had applied for the space, a couple with 2 teenage sons, modest income, solid references. He hesitated before adding that Caroline had already sent an email expressing concern about overcrowding and possible noise issues. I asked if she had mentioned any personal reasons. He said no. She had kept it professional, though her tone was the kind that assumed compliance. I told him to approve the new tenants immediately and not to mention my involvement. I hung up the phone and sat by the window for a long time, watching the bare branches sway against a pale sky. It wasn't anger I felt, not anymore, but something sharper and colder, like the calm before a necessary correction. The new family moved in quietly, carrying boxes and hope through the narrow stairwell. Within a week, the building's rhythm changed again. The teenage boys played music on weekends. Laughter spilled into the courtyard. The smell of garlic and stew drifted up through the vents. It felt alive, human, imperfect. Caroline, of course, disliked it immediately. She told the manager that her children couldn't concentrate on their piano lessons with that kind of noise coming through the floor. The irony nearly made me laugh. When Peter was young, I used to work double shifts just to afford his piano classes, and he had banged those keys like he was trying to dig his way out of poverty. Now his own child was being shielded from the sound of other people's joy. A few days later, I met Caroline in the lobby by chance. She was on her way out, fur-lined coat, heels clicking against the tile. I greeted her softly. She smiled, the kind of smile people give when they don't expect to see you again. "I've seen you before," she said, tilting her head. "Are you one of the maintenance ladies?" I told her yes, in a way. She nodded approvingly, as if validating my place in her order of things. "The building looks lovely," she added. "Whoever owns it must be quite pleased." I smiled. "She is," I said. Her brow furrowed slightly, but she didn't ask. She was already glancing at her watch. When she left, the faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air like a question that didn't deserve an answer. That winter was unusually harsh. The heating system in the basement struggled to keep up, and one night I was called down by the manager to check a burst pipe. I went, bundled in layers, carrying my tools. The basement was half flooded, cold water shimmering under the fluorescent light. While I was working, I heard footsteps behind me. Peter's voice came from the stairs. "You shouldn't be down here alone," he said. I looked up, startled not by his presence, but by the concern in his tone, genuine and unguarded. For a second, he was the boy I remembered, the one who used to fix things with me in our old house, pretending to be my little assistant. "I've handled worse," I said. He smiled, rubbing his neck. "You remind me of my mother sometimes. She used to do everything herself, too." I kept my face still. "She sounds capable," I said. He nodded. "She was. I don't call her enough. Things are complicated." I didn't respond. He crouched beside me, passing me a wrench without being asked. For a few minutes we worked in silence, the sound of metal and dripping water filling the space between us. When the leak was contained, he straightened up, wiped his hands, and said, "Thank you, ma'am." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, but instead I just nodded. He left without looking back. I watched the water settle into stillness and whispered to the empty room, "You just did." After that night, I began to see him differently, not as the cruel son who had erased me, but as a man shaped by shame he didn't know how to name. He had built his life on denial, brick by polished brick, and every act of arrogance was just fear disguised as superiority. I understood it now, but understanding doesn't always equal forgiveness. It simply removes the heat from the wound, leaving it cold and permanent. In February, I received a letter from the city's housing department. It was a notice of routine inspection, scheduled for mid-March. Standard procedure, nothing alarming, but part of me braced for disruption. Bureaucracy always has a way of revealing what people would rather keep hidden. I made sure every file was in order, every permit signed. The day before the inspection, I saw Caroline pacing in the courtyard, talking on the phone. Her voice carried through the air, sharp and irritated. "I just think it's ridiculous that we have to share space with these kinds of people," she said. "It's not what we were promised. Peter keeps saying it's temporary, but I'm the one who has to live with it." She turned, saw me standing by the stairs, and froze mid-sentence. I smiled faintly. "Cold evening," I said. She murmured something and rushed inside. Later that night, I received an anonymous email through the building's management contact form, complaining about the lack of screening for tenants. It ended with, "This property deserves better oversight." I didn't need to guess the author. The inspection went smoothly. The official, a kind woman with tired eyes, commended the cleanliness and organization of the building. As we walked through the halls, Peter passed us carrying a box of paperwork. He greeted us politely, unaware of the significance of the clipboard in my hands. The inspector asked if I was the owner. "One of many," I said. She nodded, satisfied. When she left, Peter approached me. "You do a lot around here," he said, half curious, half respectful. "The landlord's lucky to have you." I met his gaze. "Yes," I said, "she is." March melted into April, and with the thaw came noise. Hammers, repairs, movement. I decided to repaint the outer facade, something bright to lift the gloom. The tenants volunteered to help. The teenagers from downstairs carried ladders, Lila baked muffins for everyone, and laughter echoed up the street. Even Caroline's children joined for a while, smearing paint on their cheeks, their giggles filling the air. Peter watched from the balcony, arms crossed, face unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might come down, but he turned away. That evening, as I locked up the tools, I found a folded note slipped under my door. It was from the manager. "Tenant in Unit 7 inquiring about purchasing the apartment if it's ever for sale." I stared at the number, Peter's unit, and felt the slow, inevitable pull of confrontation approaching. I didn't answer immediately. I wanted him to ask directly, to look me in the eyes when he said he wanted to own what he had once deemed beneath him. 2 weeks passed before he did. He caught me in the courtyard one morning while I was pruning the shrubs. "You work here often," he said awkwardly. "Do you happen to know who owns the building?" I looked up, dirt under my nails, sunlight glinting off the windows behind him. "Why do you ask?" He hesitated. "We're thinking of buying." "It's a good investment. The area's improving." His tone was almost casual, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of calculation. "I could put in a word," I said, "but I doubt the owner's looking to sell." He smiled, a little too confidently. "Everything's for sale if the price is right." I smiled back. "Some things aren't." He tilted his head, studying me, perhaps sensing something familiar but not daring to name it. "You remind me of someone," he said finally. "A teacher I had as a kid. She had your eyes, stern but kind." I stood, wiping my hands on my apron. Then she must have been a patient woman. He laughed softly and walked away. That night, I wrote him a letter. It was short and unsigned, typed on plain paper. "This property is not available for purchase. Please refrain from further inquiries." I slid it under his door before dawn. When I saw him later that day, his expression was unreadable. He nodded politely, but there was tension in his shoulders, the kind that comes from bumping into a wall you thought you could buy your way through. Caroline, on the other hand, grew distant, her smiles tighter, her posture more brittle. They knew something was shifting, though they couldn't yet name what it was. The true escalation came unexpectedly, as most reckonings do. One evening, a heavy storm hit the city, fierce enough to knock out power for several hours. I lit candles and went to check the generator in the basement. As I descended, I heard voices. Peter and Caroline arguing. Their words bounced off the concrete walls, sharp and brittle. "You said this was temporary," she hissed. "You promised we'd be out of this dump by summer." "It's not a dump," he snapped. "We can't afford the other place right now." "We could if you stopped playing the hero with your family," she said. "You and your endless guilt over that woman." Silence. Then Peter's voice, low and pained. "She's my mother, Caroline." She scoffed. "A mother who disappeared, remember? Who doesn't even care enough to call." "You don't know anything," he said. "You think money fixes everything. She gave up everything for me." "Then where is she now?" Caroline demanded. "Where's this saint of yours while we're stuck here?" I stood in the shadows, unseen, the candle trembling in my hand. I could have spoken then, could have ended the charade, but I stayed silent. Some truths have to ripen in the dark before they're harvested. The storm passed, but something in me had changed. I realized that what I'd built was no longer just shelter. It was stage and witness. They lived beneath me, breathing the same air I'd restored, protected by the walls they once thought beneath them. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, rooted, unmovable. The next morning, I stood on the roof and looked out over the city, the wet rooftops gleaming under the sun, and whispered to the wind, "Let him learn slowly." Sometimes revelation should not be delivered. It should be discovered. That night, I dreamed again of my younger self, hands raw from work, face soft with hope, and woke with tears on my cheeks. The house was quiet, the pipes calm. I brewed tea, sat by the window, and realized I had crossed an invisible line. I no longer wanted revenge. I wanted peace. But peace, I knew, would demand one last act of clarity, and I was ready to give it. Spring arrived dressed like forgiveness, but I knew better than to mistake color for healing. The courtyard filled with blossoms, white and pink, their petals collecting on the benches where children played. The smell of wet earth climbed through the stairwell, mixing with detergent and coffee. Life went on, steady, patient. But inside me, something had started to move with deliberate calm, a kind of resolve that felt older than anger. Peter and Caroline still lived downstairs, but their voices had grown quieter lately, their rhythms subdued. The performance of perfection had thinned around the edges. Peter's shoulders seemed heavier, his laughter slower, and sometimes, late at night, I heard footsteps pacing the length of their apartment, like a man trying to walk off a truth he didn't want to face. It was almost time. It happened, fittingly, on an ordinary Thursday, the kind of day that begins without omen or special weather. The property manager called to say that Peter wanted to schedule a meeting with the owner regarding a lease extension and potential investment partnership. I told him to arrange it for that afternoon. I dressed neatly, not in anything grand, just the clothes that made me feel like myself. A pressed blouse, a soft cardigan, the silver earrings my husband gave me on our 10th anniversary. When I looked in the mirror before leaving my apartment, I saw not a tenant or a caretaker, but the quiet shape of authority. Not the loud kind that demands recognition, but the kind that doesn't need to ask twice. In the small office on the ground floor, I waited, sipping tea that had gone cold by the time the knock came. Peter entered first, carrying a folder, looking brisk and professional. Caroline followed, poised, eyes scanning the room. She stopped short when she saw me, confusion flickering for a moment before she smoothed it away. "I think there's been a mix-up," she said to the manager. "We're here to meet the owner." "You are," I said, setting down my cup. The words landed like the slow thud of a heavy book closing. Peter blinked, the polite mask faltering. "I don't understand," he said. "You own this building?" I nodded once. The silence that followed was dense, tangible, like air after thunder. Caroline laughed a little too loudly, disbelief trembling at the edge. "That's not possible. I mean, you're saying this is your property?" "It's not just mine," I said. "It's the one your children play under, the one that keeps you warm at night, the one you called temporary until something better came along." Peter sat down slowly, his face pale. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered. "Would you have come if I had?" I asked. The manager, sensing the intimacy of what was unfolding, excused himself. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving the three of us in a silence that felt both infinite and necessary. Carolyn opened her mouth, then closed it again. Peter leaned back, rubbing his temples. "All this time," he said softly, "we've been renting from you." "Yes," I replied. "And you've been good tenants, always on time." I smiled slightly. "I thought it was important for you to experience what responsibility feels like when someone else holds the keys." He looked at me, and for a moment, the arrogance dissolved. What remained was a boy sitting on a kitchen floor, surrounded by his mother's unpaid bills, promising he would grow up to take care of her. "Mom," he said, the word small, almost broken. "I don't know what to say." "You could start with thank you," I said gently. Caroline shifted in her seat, color rising to her cheeks. "This is humiliating," she muttered. "For whom?" I asked. "For you, or for the woman you decided wasn't good enough for your children to visit?" She didn't answer. Her eyes dropped to the floor. Peter tried to speak again, but words tangled in his throat. I could see the battle behind his eyes, the instinct to defend himself, to rationalize, to find language that would turn guilt into justification. I'd heard those tones all my life, in doctors and supervisors, in men who thought control was the same as strength. I spared him the effort. "You don't need to explain," I said. "I've already forgiven you. That's why I didn't tell you sooner. I needed you to live here first, to feel what it means to depend on something built by hands you dismissed. It wasn't punishment. It was perspective." He nodded slowly, his face gray with realization. "You must think I'm a terrible son." "No," I said. "I think you're a frightened man who forgot where his roots were planted." The room stayed quiet for a long time. Outside, I could hear the faint sound of children shouting in the courtyard, their laughter slicing through the stillness like sunlight through water. Finally, Peter stood. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now nothing happens," I said. "You'll keep living here if you want. Pay your rent. Take care of your family. Teach your children kindness. The building will remain yours to live in, not to own. Ownership doesn't always mean possession." Caroline rose abruptly. "You're enjoying this," she snapped. "You planned it all, didn't you?" I looked at her calmly. "I didn't plan your words, Caroline. Those were yours. I only built the walls that carried them back to you." She glared at me, then turned to Peter. "We're leaving." But he didn't move. He just sat there, staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. "I used to tell people you were dead," he said quietly. "It was easier than admitting I was ashamed." My throat tightened, but I didn't let tears come. "Then today, let me come back to life." He covered his face with his hands. The sound of his breathing filled the room, uneven, human. Caroline left without another word. The door slammed softly behind her. Peter stayed seated, looking older than I'd ever seen him. "I thought I was protecting them," he murmured. "From what?" I asked. "From poverty," he said. I leaned forward. "You can't protect your children from reality, Peter. You can only teach them how to face it without cruelty." He nodded, eyes glistening. "You've done well," I said after a moment. "You made a life. You built a family. But in building it, you forgot the foundation." He looked up. "And you're the foundation?" "No," I said. "I'm the reminder." We sat in silence again, the kind that feels like an ending but isn't. Finally, he rose, hesitated, then leaned forward to kiss my forehead, the way he used to when he was small, and wanted to show me he'd forgiven me for saying no to something trivial. "I'm sorry," he said, voice cracking. "I know," I answered. "Go home, Peter." He left without looking back, shoulders bowed, and I stayed behind, listening to his footsteps fade down the corridor until all that remained was the soft hum of the building itself. I looked around the small office, the papers, the keys, the plant by the window, and felt a deep quiet settle over me. Not triumph, not revenge, but balance. Later that evening, as the sun began to dip, I walked through the courtyard. The petals from the blossoming trees had fallen like confetti, covering the benches and the path. The children were gone. The air was cool. I looked up at the window of their apartment. The curtains were drawn, but I could see movement inside, silhouettes crossing, the shape of a man holding a child. I imagined Peter kneeling to explain, imagined the confusion in their little faces, the way innocence always struggles to make sense of adult shame. I whispered a small prayer that he would find gentleness in his confession. When the streetlights flickered on, I sat on the steps and watched the shadows stretch across the courtyard. Everything was still. Somewhere above, a light turned off, then another. I felt the weight of years lift quietly from my chest. The woman who had been told she was too poor to visit now sat at the heart of what she had built, surrounded by life, by laughter, by her own endurance. I realized that power isn't in proving someone wrong. It's in standing so completely in your truth that they have no room left to doubt it. The night wind rose, cool and sweet, carrying the smell of blossoms and rain. I closed my eyes and let it pass through me, steady, forgiving, endless. The weeks after that meeting unfolded like the quiet after a storm. The kind of calm that feels undeserved but necessary, as if life itself pauses to let you breathe before continuing its slow, inevitable rhythm. Peter and I did not speak for several days, and I didn't expect him to. I had learned long ago that remorse needs silence to mature. Too much conversation, and it wilts into excuses. From my window, I could see him sometimes in the courtyard, walking with the children, carrying groceries, fixing the bicycle his son had left in the rain. His movements were slower now, deliberate, almost careful, as if he had finally realized that the ground beneath him wasn't owned by him, but borrowed from a greater patience. Caroline kept her distance. She passed me in the hallway once, eyes lowered, perfume subdued, a polite ghost of her former self. She murmured, "Good afternoon," and I nodded, offering nothing more. The air between us was neutral, emptied of battle. Some wounds don't close through reconciliation, but through fatigue. One Sunday morning, I heard a soft knock at my door. When I opened it, two small faces looked up at me, the children, dressed in their school uniforms, though it was the weekend. The girl held a plate of cookies, slightly misshapen, edges burned. "Dad said we should bring these to the flower lady," she said solemnly. Her brother nudged her, whispering something, and she added, "He also said—" "Your grandma." The word landed like sunlight on skin too long kept in shadow. I stepped aside and invited them in. They wandered around my small apartment, curious and unafraid, pointing at the plants, the framed photographs, the knitting basket by the window. I poured them milk, and we sat together at the table, the same table where I had once cried over their father's rejection. Now it held crumbs and laughter instead of sorrow. They asked about my garden, about the old building, about why I liked flowers so much. I told them plants teach patience, that they grow even when no one's watching, as long as you give them room to breathe. The girl nodded, serious beyond her years, and said, "Like people." I smiled. Children always understand first what adults spend decades unlearning. Later that afternoon, Peter came to fetch them. He hesitated at the door, eyes searching my face for permission to enter. I gestured toward the kitchen. "They've eaten half the cookies," I said. He laughed quietly, the sound both familiar and foreign. He looked around the room, taking in the simplicity of it, the way the light fell on the curtains. "I used to hate this smell," he said after a moment. "Soap and lavender. It's how home used to smell when you'd wash the floors on Saturdays." "I still do," I replied. "Some habits don't retire." He nodded, then exhaled, a long, trembling sigh. "Caroline's gone to her mother's for a while. She says she needs time." I didn't comment. He sat down heavily, elbows on his knees, and whispered, "I don't know how to fix what I broke." "You don't fix it," I said. "You tend to it." You keep showing up, even when it's awkward or late. Love doesn't need grand gestures, Peter. It just needs consistency. He looked at me, eyes wet, and said, "You sound like you did when I was little." "That's because you're finally listening like you did when you were little," I answered. We didn't speak of the past again. There was no need. Truth, once spoken aloud, doesn't vanish. It settles like dust on every surface until you learn to live with it. Weeks turned into months. The building grew busier with spring, the sound of radios from open windows, laughter from the courtyard, the scent of soil after rain. I tended to the garden every morning, pruning, watering, replanting. The tenants greeted me warmly. They had started calling me Miss M again, and I liked the sound of it, unpretentious and kind. Sometimes Peter joined me, helping with the heavier pots. He never said much, but his presence was steady, respectful. The children ran between us, chasing butterflies, their laughter echoing off the brick walls. One evening, after the sun had dipped below the rooftops, I sat on the bench by the entrance, hands folded in my lap. The lights from the windows glowed one by one, small golden squares in the twilight. I thought of Eleanor, my sister, and whispered a thank you to her memory. Without her quiet generosity, none of this would have happened. I thought of the woman I had been a year ago, the one who still waited for invitations, who measured her worth by her son's attention, and I felt both pity and tenderness for her. She hadn't known that sometimes dignity comes disguised as solitude. Now, when people pass by and see me sitting in the courtyard, they probably think I'm just an old woman resting after a long day. They can't see that every brick around them carries a piece of my defiance, that every flower in bloom is a refusal to stay unseen. I own the building, yes, but more than that, I own the space I occupy in this world, without apology or permission. Peter still calls me every week. The conversations are simple: weather, the children's school, recipes. But each word is an act of repair, small and consistent. The way a cracked wall is mended with patient hands. Carolyn writes polite notes sometimes, short and cautious, and that's enough. I no longer crave more. As night deepens, I listen to the murmur of life through the walls, the clatter of dishes, the music, the muffled laughter. These sounds no longer make me ache. They remind me that the world goes on, that love is not always loud or symmetrical. I look up at the window where my grandchildren sleep and feel a warmth spread through me that no wealth or apology could ever buy. I think of what Peter once said, that I was too poor to visit, and I smile softly. Maybe I was poor then, not in money, but in faith. Poor in the belief that silence was safety. Now I am rich in the only way that matters, in peace, in time, in the knowledge that everything I lost returned in a quieter form. The petals from the courtyard trees drift past my feet, gathering like snow. I let them fall. Some stories don't end in forgiveness or punishment. They end in recognition. And recognition, I've learned, is its own kind of grace.